Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. This week's episode comes to you from Tallinn, Estonia. I've had a great week here looking at Operation Springstorm, which is a NATO exercise on the Russian border, and really quizzing whether Donald Trump's threats to withdraw from NATO and some of the withdrawals that have been planned for this part of the world are having any effect at the operational level. Something that my next guest keeps a keen eye on, amongst many other things. I'm very thrilled to say Kaupo Rosin, who is the head of Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service, has agreed to his first podcast interview, and it's with me. So I began our discussion by asking him if Ukraine has the upper hand in the war.
Well, when I look at the current situation, then I do see that the Russians are not doing too well. And I would say I think we are currently in the situation where the time actually is not on Russia's side anymore.
When did this change happen?
I think it has happened gradually over the last months, maybe half year. Russians lose more people on the battlefield than they can recruit currently. The Russian economy is deteriorating. The same is for the finance sphere or financial domain. So the overall trend for Russia, as I see currently, is actually unfavourable.
Does that mean it's possible we could start talking about a world where Putin's Russia collapses?
Collapse is, I think, maybe too far-fetched. I do not see really them like seriously economically collapsing too soon or politically. But let's say there are more and more factors which are playing against Russia, which I already said. And I think on the Russian side, it will start to flow more and more into different calculations or decision-making they do.
What do we know about Putin's state of mind? And I know this is it's the easiest but hardest subject to discuss, but I ask this quite seriously as opposed to previous years when we might have speculated about Putin's mind, because we've actually seen some signs of things beginning to maybe rattle him. Victory Day, he had to ask for a ceasefire. He didn't display tanks. What is your assessment of what's going on in Putin's head?
Difficult to say, obviously, but okay, if we compare visual, for example, from 2022 versus now, well, he has gotten much, much older, and yeah, it's visible, definitely. Well, he's coming from a field of work where some level of paranoia is anyway present. Being a dictator is not an easy job, and that has an impact on psychology. Trust issue, you have to ask, who can you trust, who can you not trust? So I'm sure it has an impact on him. Hard to say how big is the impact, but regarding Ukraine, I see that he is still very much fixated on that country. It's like an ideological issue for him.
So Ukraine's advances that we discussed, they're not materially shaping or changing his view of how long he can conduct this war?
I think the question is how much he understands or wants to understand, that's a separate question, the overall situation in Russia. I'm sure the, let's say, military brass or the top generals are reporting him successes and how Ukraine will break. And so because it's the Russian system...
So you still think they are reporting faulty information to him?
I would say so, yes. But because the culture, let's say this Russian system, that's the culture. You cannot report your failures, obviously. But we know that people around him understand the economic situation, the financial situation. They also know what's actually happening in the battlefield. And the question is how much of this gets through to Putin. Does he understand? Does he want to understand? Does he hope or think that actually West will break away first? Well, it's hard to say, but the main point here, I think, is that we can analyze Russia and so on, but we still have to think and pay attention to our own actions, what we're going to do about this. So support for Ukraine must continue. Sanctions against Russia, which absolutely work and have already put a lot of pressure on the Russian economy. These must be continued, implemented, new sanctions, and so on. So we cannot stay static on our side and then just hope that Russia will then reconsider something. That both sides are moving, and we just have to keep moving on our side.
What evidence do we have that the sanctions are working, and when do you feel that they began to really bite?
Well, I would say one of the factors we can take a look is the Russian state budget. And here I see that two types of sanctions have a big impact. First, sanctions against the financial sector, banking sector, and then sanctions against the energy sector, oil exports and the gas exports. And which these sanctions together, we call it resource limiting sanctions. And even if you are dictator and it's Russia and okay, the Russians can take a lot, but you still need money to run a country and keep the war machinery working.
How much damage do we think has been done to his ability to produce oil?
Well, we have to look at it in combination. One is the oil production capability, which the Ukrainians are attacking, relatively successful, which limits then the capacity to produce. And the other point is the export capability. And again, the sanctions directed against that. So it's all a combination of measures which then have a cumulated effect.
But you think they're definitely starting to harm his ability?
Absolutely.
Have the sanctions that were uneased by the Trump administration on Putin's oil, have they given him a bit of a...
Well, it creates additional revenue, and also the high oil prices currently also gives additional revenue. But again, in the longer term, it will not save Russia, even with the high oil prices. If you take the Russian state budget, and they did plan for this year a deficit of, I think, 3.7 trillion rubles. By the end of February, okay, it was before the Iran kicked off, they were already at 3.4 trillion deficit produced in 2 months. And for the whole year, it was 3.7 planned. So that already shows that. And the question is then, for them, where do they get the money? So there are options, of course. Let's say military is absolutely prioritized, yes, as it was in Soviet Union. Okay, tax increase, customs, whatever measures, they can do all that, but it comes at the cost of the rest of economy, which is taking a heavy blow already.
What has enabled Ukraine to make the advances we've seen this year as opposed to previous years?
Several factors again. Ukraine still absolutely needs Western support, not only military but financial support, and I'm very happy to see that the EU loan has moved forward. That was a very important question. But the Ukrainians have also innovated themselves incredibly in the military technology domain, especially in the unmanned systems. And I think these innovations have helped Ukraine to maybe compensate the problems which also they have with the manpower. And in the current battlefield, let's say, it is very hard to move forward. And okay, it is for both sides. It's hard for Ukrainians to launch some attack, but it's also for the Russians to launch some attack. And this, let's say, attrition, relatively static warfare. And then also from the Russian side, the questions come up, okay, how long should we then do this? What's the result of all this?
So has Ukraine formed its own ability to conduct long or mid-range strikes or deep strikes? I know there's different terms. Maybe you can help unpack what they mean and what they enable Ukraine to do inside Russia.
When I speak in military categories, then it is tactical, operational, and strategic. Strikes against the oil infrastructure, for example, these are strategic strikes against enemy economy. And we see that the Ukrainians are getting better and better in that, obviously, technologically. Then, okay, on the tactical level, the front line, stuff that happens in the front line or the 40, 50 kilometer depth, where the FPV drones and others are operating. And then the question is now, which I also see more and more, is the area in the middle, the operational level. So not, let's say, strikes not maybe thousands of kilometers, but between 100 to 400 kilometer range, which is the composites of the Russian logistics system for the front line, which is then impacted.
Okay, so you said before, and I think this has been happening since about the anniversary of the full-scale invasion this year, that Russia is not able to remobilize as quickly as Ukrainians are killing Russians now. What are Putin's choices for filling that gap?
Yes, so that's, if he would like to achieve a breakthrough militarily, he would need much more people on the battlefield than he has currently or what he currently can produce. How to do that? Well, almost the only option on the table would be then some level of mobilization. Technically, it would be doable, and the Russians could do it technically much better than they did it in the September-October 2022, which was a little bit of a mess.
And what would that involve?
Well, yeah, I think they could collect the people, but the other question, and also it's concern for the Kremlin, is what tensions would it create in the society and internally? And I would say these tensions or dynamics, what then would be created, is not positive for the Kremlin, which doesn't mean they wouldn't decide. You never know how they decide then. And it is then hard to predict in what way it would go. But it's, let's say, it would not create a positive dynamics for Kremlin. It would create a very negative dynamic. Would it be a revolution? I'm not sure about that, but still it's another heavy burden. And we know that Kremlin is already concerned about the internal stability.
How do we know that?
Well, we know that people who deal with this issue are monitoring it very carefully through different secret, polls and stuff. So they have the tabs on in the regions, and I think they understand very well what's the mood in different regions of Russia. And then they try to also manage this somehow. But again, the problem here is that the resources for managing this are very, very limited or not there. And in addition, what already creates an interesting situation in Russia are the war veterans who are coming back. And there are some, and that's already, well, it creates more and more of an issue, starting from the street criminality, but up to the organized crime groups then who will recruit such people. So interesting.
So Putin has not yet mobilized men from where? Is it the cities? And is that what that cocktail of potential unrest or deep unhappiness would create?
Well, he has, what we see currently is not mobilization, it is recruitment. It's still, okay, it's maybe, there is a lot of pressure to people.
Yeah, I thought it was semi-forced, his mobilization.
It is, we know that they are, let's say, big factories are given quotas, they should then deliver. Yes, it is pressurized, but mobilization then would mean that people who are at home get a notice to show up in the military commissariat, and then they go to, and it's no discussion room. This is not yet, or not happening at the moment at least. And that would, I think a lot of people in Russia still feel safe from the war, so they don't see the threat that they will end up in the war. But then if there is mobilization in the military system, there is no individual approach. It's groups who are mobilized, and then anybody can be hit. It doesn't matter who you are. Okay, it can be regionally maybe divided, but still, and that would create an interesting situation, I think.
One of the fascinating developments inside Russia this year has been him closing down the internet, closing down Telegram, which is a very popular messaging app, it'd be like us shutting down iMessage and WhatsApp. Why is he doing that?
I see that he would like to have the control over the information domain. It controls, let's say, or it hampers the ability of people to communicate, share their views, contain bad news. And I think it's about the information domain control. And we have Duma elections coming in September and so on. But interestingly, this has been taken very badly from the population. So the restriction of internet and also shutting down different apps like Telegram, WhatsApp, and so on. And this, let's say, unhappiness is throughout the society. It's from the normal people up to the very high-level oligarchs. And it also has an impact on, let's say, business activity in Russia. And this is something that people, let's say, people who are in the business and make money, they do not like it at all.
You say he wants control over information. I mean, he's always wanted control over information and been quite successful at that. But why this extra step? Is there something that's filtering out in the information sphere that he's trying to suppress? Is it a potential unrest that he's trying to quell?
I think he feels that in such way he has a bigger control over the population. Because people in Russia still discussed with each other, and it didn't happen publicly, but still people changed their views and so on. But this gives a tool of control over what narratives and information can you spread among the Russian population. It gives the state information dominance.
And so how would you describe the situation for Putin now? Some observations that have been given here in Estonia this week have been that Putin is nervous, that he is on more of an edge than the West or Ukraine has ever been able to take him to that place. How would you describe it?
Well, I think, yes, I don't know about the age, but definitely the pressure is growing. And the main question is, when and how does it impact his decision-making? I think that's the question. And I think, again, from our side, we have to maximum from our side to put more and more pressure. And it is in our interest that he would reconsider Ukraine, for example. And I think that's the main point.
What do you think from where you sit in this ecosystem of this discussion that's going on about European leaders potentially opening up talks with Putin? Are we there yet?
Well, I hear all this, let's talk to Putin and so on, but I haven't heard what is the agenda then? What we're going to talk? And I do not see from Russian side any willingness to talk to Europeans really. They would like to talk to the Americans, which they consider then the leader of the West. And well, they obviously consider America as a superpower who can really influence the dynamics. I do not see real interest on Russian side to talk to somebody from Europe. And again, the question is, what do we negotiate? What do we have to offer? In order to have proper negotiation, both sides should make compromises. Currently, I do not see still on the negotiation track, any will to compromise something. So it is, let's not, run into that trap.
So the constant refrain is that the Baltics are next, Estonia, Narva. That's where Putin might test NATO. Do you believe that is the case?
Well, I would say currently no, but the question is about the future also. We have to look the years ahead. And first, I think the rhetorics about Estonia or Baltics as something separate region, isolated from the EU, NATO, is playing into Russian narrative. Russia would like to see us as a separate special region where Russia would have like a privileged interest and the right to dictate the agenda. I see that the threat from Russia, and I absolutely understand that we all understand that Russia is an existential threat for us, and it has always been, always. But if Russia would do something, it's not about the Baltics, it's then all Europe, it's NATO, everybody is involved. So no hope that, let's say, France or Spain can sleep easily and something happens only here and it stays. It does not. It will impact everybody, everybody. So we should talk about the threat to the NATO and or the threat to the European Union. I think that's the point here. And here we talk about deterrence, actually. So again, the question is, we can admire Russia and calculate all these wild scenarios, and of course in the military field we have to play by scenarios and then plan according to that. But the point is that we have to do our homework, invest into defense, develop capabilities in Europe also, get stronger. If we do all that properly, then we can deter and contain Russia. If we sleep and hope for something, well, who knows what will happen?
So Estonians have never been asleep on this question.
No.
Your minister this morning and the Latvian minister said that the area, Estonia and Latvia, are developing their own mid and deep strike capabilities. What is that about?
Well, we understand that if in any military scenario we have to be able to influence the enemy rear area, and there are capabilities which we are developing in that regard.
And the point of this is to say to Moscow, what, don't come near us. We could attack you in Moscow if you try.
Well, let's say that's, of course, not the only military capability, but the combination of capabilities. We have to be able to fight on the front line and then in all echelons on the rear to carry the fight into the enemy territory.
So I've just come back from Operation Springstorm, yes, near the Russian border, and everybody there says NATO, a collaboration with the United States is perfect. It's still working at the operational level. But what is your understanding of how Russia reads the signals that Donald Trump puts out about NATO being a paper tiger? The Europeans aren't up to it. He would like to withdraw on any other given day. Do we think this is having an effect on how Russia thinks NATO and its Article 5 is credible or not?
Well, I think it has different levels at the end. First, for Russia, US is the enemy still. They do not trust the Americans also. Despite different rhetorics, they are watching and will watching what happens on the ground. And I think that's the calculation they are making. And if you look at the military collaboration with the US, also in the NATO, yes, it's happening. Americans are part of the planning, defense plans, everything. As long as this continues, despite the different rhetorics, Russians understand the situation, I think.
It's not just rhetoric, though. We do have an announced withdrawal of 5,000 troops from Germany, a hold on a rotation in Poland, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there's been a pause on sending you HIMARS, I think it is. So they are actually material actions. Is that not costing the effect of Article 5, the deterrent effect?
Well, it's definitely not helpful for us. But again, I would say the Americans are present here still and will be, even with rotation issues. So I haven't seen the Americans really leaving Europe. Obviously, what the American idea is that Europeans must take more of the burden, which totally makes sense to me.
And the reason I ask you this question is not to draw you into a political argument as such, but there was a very interesting comment made on one of the panels this morning that there's a perfect storm approaching for Europe, where the UK is in political turmoil. We have right-wing populist movements in Germany and France, and also political turmoil in those countries. And you have the US making all these signals about NATO, whether we believe them or not. And that if you were Putin, despite what you say here in Estonia about the Russians not being on the other side of the border because they're in Ukraine, now is actually a really, really good time just to check if Article 5 works. Isn't that very compelling, and don't you think that's the case?
Well, one thing what Russia also needs to take into calculation or consideration is that at least historically, and the Russians know that very well, external shocks to Europe or Euro-Atlantic have actually had an effect of, again, pulling us together. So, and if you take the current situation that Russia's resources are tied in Europe, in Ukraine, any external shock could have an effect that everybody invests much more into defense and so on. Okay, it's hard to say what the Russians will decide at the end, but these are factors they know, absolutely. And I think that's also helpful. We know very well that Russia is actually very concerned about the European militarization, as they say, or rearmament. So they think that if Europe keeps the pace, Europe would be capable to stand against Russia in a couple of years already without the US.
But doesn't that actually fit into this theory that the best time to test NATO is right now?
It would, but then resources are in Ukraine currently, military resource.
At the start of the war, the CIA, I think it was, put out an announcement saying, Russians, come and talk to us if you are very displeased with this war and things going on. Did you do the same? And have you had any experience of Russians coming to you proactively to give you intelligence because they're unhappy with the war? And how is the state of your human intelligence operations compared to pre-war?
Well, it's hard to comment on that. What can I say is that I think you are absolutely right that there are people in the Russian system who are unhappy with the current trajectory. And, well, people want to have a better future for their families maybe. So these are different aspects which throughout the history have been used in the human intelligence. But I think we are not doing bad.
I read with great interest your report that you put out, studying the relationship between China and Russia. Where do you think this China-Russia relationship is heading in the context of what looks like a very weakened Russia right now?
Well, first, I think it's important to note that China and Russia are partners, but not allies. They have similar interests, which is anti-West, anti-US. This is something what brings them together. Both countries have their own interests, obviously. And I think without Chinese support, one way or another, Russia, it would be very hard for Russia to fight this war. Let's say different dual-use goods and all this sanctions evasion and so on. Well, but I see that in this relationship, China is actually the dominating partner here. And we know that in the Russian leadership levels, they do not like too much what the Chinese are demanding or what's the Chinese agenda towards Russia, because they see that Russia is exploited, maybe. But there is nothing much they can do, really, about it. So China, as it is, always slowly pushing their own agenda, also towards Russia.
Do you think it's possible, Garry Kasparov was saying this afternoon, that China could turn around eventually and gobble parts of Russian territory?
Like military invasion?
Not necessarily invasion, but if they're so weak, they can just slowly do what Russia's been doing.
Okay, hard to... do they need that, really, is the question. Or can they exploit Russian resources also without any land grab, which would then create a totally new dynamic. I think the situation is very favorable for China. They are able to, or they have the leverage in order to, exploit whatever they need from Russia: gas, oil, whatever other resources that they need. I do not see, let's say, the need for, conduct something militarily there.
And if I'm back with you at Lennart Meri in a year's time, do we talk about Ukrainian victory?
Victory for either side, I would say unlikely at this point. Depending how the dynamics will go with the peace talk, Russian economy development, but I would say there are two scenarios. One is still fighting. Question is with what intensity, or some type of, let's say, frozen conflict, something where both sides still hold the line militarily and then just keep the position with, let's say, fighting sparking up from time to time.
Kaupo Rosin, thank you for having me in beautiful Estonia, and thank you so much for granting me this interview.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.